destructive forces of humankind. But before he speaks, I would like to pass the floor to another philosopher, Todorov, who is also a professor, a doctor of philosophy from the Sofia University. He also took part in Zinoviev readings in the past, and I would like to ask him to share his perspective on the questions we're discussing.
Let me first answer the question you put at the beginning. Yes, there is an end to capitalism, but there is maybe something worse coming after. And maybe this is our only hope. So let me explain what I mean. First, there is no way to predict how capitalism will develop and how it will possibly end, because capitalism is maybe the most dynamic, the most adaptive, the most changing, the most vital social, economic, and cultural form that we know up till now. So we see that, like in the research of Brodel, we see different forms of capitalism, starting from the Mediterranean, the Venetian capitalism. Then we have today we have a digital capitalism. So maybe there is no way to predict the end of capitalism, but let me put a very important point or hypothesis here. Capitalism and globalization started together. They started with capitalism in a way is globalization. It is always expanding, it is always globalizing. But there is a certain dialectics at work here. So my hypothesis is that we may predict the end of globalization, and probably we may see how globalization may put an end to capitalism, because my hypothesis is that globalization is a finite process. It's a process that can reach a moment of completion, which may not say about capitalism. But let me first start with a remark about the famous sociological novel by Zinoviev, The Yawning Heights. There he talks about an imaginary country he calls Ibansk. And I must tell you that maybe Ibansk is not a place. It is a time. It is not a country, but it is an epoch. Because Zinoviev tells us how the end of history might look like. And I think that the book will be rediscovered in the future. It will be reprinted. It will be commented again maybe in the far future, or maybe in the near future, when the processes are really, because the processes are really, really dynamic. So the question is, what will happen if nothing happens? That is to say, if there is no intervention, because now we live in times where we don't believe in revolution anymore. We don't believe in the possibility that we can intervene, that there may be some event of a revolutionary nature that can break capitalism and start a new kind of society. So let's try and see what will happen if nothing happens. Then we come to my next hypothesis, that the end of capitalism will come not as a liberation or revolution, but as a catastrophe. And that's how we see a much gloomier Ibansk at the end of history. We may see Ibansk as the finale of globalization, because there is a certain process that we may call the shrinking of the world. There has been a lot of talk since the beginning of the century about the flat world, the flattening of the world in a kind of a positive sense. There is a book by Thomas Friedman called The World is Flat, where he tells us that the world is flat in a very good sense, that there are no more these radical borders, that there is freedom of movement, freedom of communication. The world is an open place where we can plug, play, compete, connect, and collaborate with more equal power than ever before. But what we see today is quite the opposite. The world is moving not in this positive flatness, but is moving in another way. We live in a hothouse, we live in a crystal palace where all the goods of the world are concentrated, and then there is another world which we don't see, And there are now inequalities which seem unbridgeable. There is a colonization of life by a technical rationality and a self-reproducing power. This is what I call the dark side of globalization. It is also connected to the end of politics, to the end of political pluralism, and connected to the end of difference of the parties, which Zinoviev predicted a long time ago. I think in the 90s he wrote about that. Now we see it already. Democracy is conceived of as a kind of a tool, a kind of a mechanism to support the status quo. It is conceived of, if I may use this architectural language, democracy is not a renovation anymore, it is just a restoration procedure, keeping and reproducing the order that we have today. It's just a reproduction of power. So we may say that maybe fundamentalism is the future of politics, a kind of a hegemonic thinking, where we return to a kind of a fundamental understanding and conceiving of the world and the way we can act in the world. So let me come back to the point of globalization. Globalization is something like, it says something like that: this is your life and there is no other. This is the way globalization is working today, which doesn't mean that globalization itself is something bad we should oppose at any cost. I believe that we may have another different project for globalization, which also Alexander Zinoviev called an outer globalization. So there is a chance, but I still work on the hypothesis: what will happen if nothing happens? And globalization goes on, and capitalism goes on, but by its own inertia, by its own natural movement. And we see this globalization running really fast, really dynamic, and it also produces fears. It fuels conservative revolutions all around the globe. So let me explain my point of, that I mentioned at the beginning, that globalization is a finite process, and that globalization is complete, contrary to capitalism, which is never complete. In a certain sense, there is no end of capitalism when we conceive of it just by itself. So globalization is complete when there is a hegemony of global capital, politics, and reason, all hitched together, interconnected, inseparable, with no alternatives to it. This is the completion of globalization. It is a one-dimensional world, a kind of a hothouse, which would be also the end of capitalism, but it will be something worse than that. Now let's see the logic of it. Another hypothesis, another point I'm putting here, is that we should define modernity not by economic growth or growth of production, but rather we should define it by a growth of power, and also new forms of power: surveillance, thought scripting, desire, mass media, self-discipline, culture industry, etc., etc. Biopolitics, genetic engineering is also power tools. So another very important point I want to make. Maybe we think of the completion of globalization in a horizontal manner, which means a global monopolization and unipolarity of the world. That is to say, when the world becomes one. But there is also a vertical globalization. And the completeness, the end of globalization, comes then when we have not only the horizontal process complete, but also the vertical process. Let me explain what I mean. This vertical globalization consists of kind of vertical symbiosis. It is a globalization of different social spheres, different social agents, and also different spheres of knowledge and economy. This means that at some point we may experience a merging of public and underground economies, a merging of legal and black markets. We may experience a merging of criminal, commercial, and political powers. And we already see that with the new, with the cryptocurrencies, deep web, you know, the new digital economies. Everything becomes one. And when all is one, nothing is legitimate anymore. This is a very important point here, because a state of illegitimacy of order, and we already experienced something like that, this state of illegitimacy, is a revolutionary state. Let me remind you of Russia in 1917. That was exactly what happened. It was a total illegitimacy of the whole political order at the time, and it was a revolutionary state. Another important point is the dialectics of globalization and the dialectics of technology, because globalization started also with the rise of technology and was always moved by new technologies, new forms of technological power. But today we reach a point where these technologies may produce a kind of a superclass or superhumans, and then also subclasses and subhumans, which means that we will have an unsurmountable inequalities. Inequalities that cannot be, you know, the gap between them cannot be filled. There was here a point made about Ray Kurzweil and the singularity moment. I will come to that in a few moments, because we reach something like that. Technology produces a new kind of humans, and then we have these unsurmountable inequalities, and that is also not capitalism, because capitalism, from its beginning, it always had as a kind of a promise the idea of social movement, the idea that you can become more, that you can earn more, that you can start with a few dollars and you can become okay, this is a myth, of course, especially today in the contemporary state of capitalism, but still, when you have a situation of unsurmountable inequalities that has nothing to do with capitalism anymore. And let me, in the end, just mention Nietzsche, who used to talk about the last man, who is the goal of modern society and Western civilization. And also, this last man who is tired of life, who takes no risks, and seeks only comfort and security. The last man chooses pathetic comforts over life. And let me finish with something like that. There is a certain kind, I think, a certain kind of time paradox of modernity. Because in traditional societies, in pre-modern or pre-capitalistic societies, the way time was thought about, especially the future, was like that. Future is somewhere far away. Future is in the end of history. Then, in modernity, the situation kind of changed. Future is now in the modern world. Future is now. Future is today. We already live in the future. We are the people of the future. And the next step, in a more pessimistic manner, the next step is that future becomes a past. There is no future to expect. We may discuss that at the round table more. So we have this absolute shrinking of the world. And let me come back to the example of Ibansk. In Ibansk, there is no tomorrow. The clocks obey a new mechanism of time, since time is a social category. It is also a very important point. Time is not just a physical concept, it is also a social category. Our way of life defines how time is running. Our social experience gives time shape. So, the clocks in the banks, they obey a new mechanism of time, and they're ticking backwards towards a state of singularity. That is what I described, you know, the shrinking of the world when everything becomes one, commercial, criminal, political power, it all merges into one. We have this kind of singularity, which is the end of capitalism.
Tudor, еще минут.
Yes, I'm finishing, last sentence, yes. So then dialectically, at this point of singularity, all the future is ahead of us once more. And maybe this singularity will be at the same time the chance for the future. It will be a new possibility of time. Thank you.
Ну, очень интересная позиция, любопытная. Если коротко для тех, кто не понял, не имел наушника.
Capitalism will win all over the world. Capitalism will be global, but when it turns into a planetary status, it will reach its end. Capital will no longer be important. Power will be important. This is this super society that Zinoviev wrote about. And then there was this idea how this anti-capitalistic revolution might happen. And now let's listen to our friend from China, Wang Haiqing, Vice President of